Hi everyone, Grant K here for the Flame Learning channel. In the previous video, we looked at the live preview result viewer in action. This gives an accurate pixel-based view of your 3D composite, including any post-processing effects in Flame 2017. As a reminder, this is the new default viewer in action. But if you toggle the 3 keyboard shortcut, you're able to switch between the old 3D geometry view and the live preview. So in the context of action, you can pretty much create finished results. But if you want to build further onto your composite, you actually have a few options. Looking at the batch schematic, you could take the output of action and plug it into other processing nodes in the flow graph. So the basic concept is that you take a result from one node, plug it into another, and process it further. Hence, your flow graphs will grow as you use more processors. But coming back to the Action 3D Compositor, there is a wealth of information available other than just the final rendered result. This is the same for other 3D applications like Maya and 3ds Max. So in a typical 3D pipeline, you would have multiple render passes representing all the different pieces of 3D information. Action has also been able to do this for a while, but the workflow was fairly limiting, as well as limited render passes for 3D post effects. In Flame 2017, this has all changed, and the action render outputs now have similar to what you would find in other Autodesk 3D applications. Let's break this down further. Select your action node to see its controls, and click the output menus. The action render outputs use a system of render layers and render passes. So similar to Maya, you have a render layer and you can define multiple render passes to the layer. You can actually create multiple render layers and have multiple render passes assigned to each render layer. This is a much more granular way of defining your action outputs compared to the previous version of the Flame products. If you're a long-time Flame artist, it might take a small time adjusting to the new workflow. However, you can still work in the old methodology while you get used to the new one. For example, each render layer has one primary output. You can still add multiple render layers, or what you knew as render outputs, and define a different primary render pass per layer. So I'll create a second render layer and assign it a matte, and another render layer and assign it as a Z depth. So this is exactly how you had in previous versions. The problem with the old workflow is that for every render layer is that you would have to name them individually, as well as go through the object list and assign which 3D objects are part of that render output. Now that might not sound so bad, but when you start breaking down your 3D composite to isolate specific objects, or perhaps create a distinction between foreground and background objects, you will need to do it for every render layer. As your 3D composites get more advanced and you want to do more things with render passes, the old workflow becomes very counterproductive. So I'll delete the extra render layers for now and show you the new workflow. Just before I start, one small habit I'd like you to get into is to always select your result view before toggling your outputs. If you don't do this, the views will not update when you start adjusting settings. With that out the way, the first thing to know is that you will always have one render layer with one render pass by default. This render pass is normally the composite or final render output, and you can see it defined under the primary output header. The primary output can actually be any render pass as you saw earlier, but you don't need to do anything as this is just a default setting. The middle section of the interface covers your render passes for the selected render layer. Straight away, you can see the comp render pass, and it is defined as the primary output. The small colored dot to the left of the comp render pass corresponds with the active output of the action node in the batch schematic. So the action node is currently only outputting the composite result. If you start clicking through the list of render passes, they will be displayed in the result view. At this point, you are only looking at the image data. I'll reiterate that you are not assigning any render passes as an action node output at this point. Your action node will still only have one output in the batch schematic. If you want to activate your render pass as part of a render layer output, click on the grayed out dot next to the relevant render pass. When you do this, each render pass will have its own colored dot, and if you look at the action node, you will see each render pass output with its color matching the output menu. You could then take these render pass outputs and connect them to other parts of the flow graph. There are a couple major benefits with this workflow. Firstly, let's say you need to rename all the render passes. That's pretty easy. Select the render layer and click Rename. You can call this whatever you want. When you click Enter, all the render pass outputs are renamed. The second major benefit is the object list to the right of the interface. Using this list in combination with the action schematic and the Edit Outputs tool, you can choose what is rendered in the current render layer. And as I'm sure you've already guessed, that any changes you make to the object list will automatically apply to all render passes for this render layer. This is a massive time saver instead of doing one render pass per render layer at a time. The final benefit, which is equally huge, is if you want to break down your action composite into multiple render layers and render passes to have a very granular workflow, you can do this in a very easy way. Just select the existing render layer and click Copy. A new render layer is created with a copy of all the assigned render passes. You can now go ahead and rename it. You can see how this is reflected in the action node in the batch schematic. And as I mentioned earlier, you could now edit the output list for each render layer, and that will be passed on to all the render passes instantly. This is a major improvement over what was available in previous versions of Flame. Now let's discuss some of the details with regards to render passes. Firstly, when you click through the render passes, you are simply viewing them. If they are not assigned as active render passes for output, then they will not impact on your system's performance. The render passes will only be generated when you explicitly turn them on or use camera effects post-processing. Now you can either use the 1 or 2 keyboard shortcuts to navigate up and down the active render passes. To view any inactive render passes in the viewer, simply select the text in the list. Now there are a couple global as well as local controls for the render passes. The Rendering tab contains a variety of global settings that control what visual properties are displayed in the composite. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I just want to point out anti-aliasing under the accumulation header. By default, only the RGBA channels have anti-aliasing. The render passes are typically aliased and jagged for various post-processing effects, but you can change that to all if you are experimenting. Back in the Outputs menu, you will find the Global Threshold slider. This is very important because it controls how alpha is managed in the 3D information for the render passes. For example, there are a variety of values in a semi-transparent alpha channel. This normally happens when keying hair, smoke, water, and glass. The threshold controls how much of the semi-transparent values affect the 3D information in the render passes, like Z-depth for instance. I'll have an example of this in a future video. Finally, as you step through the various render passes, you will see the local controls update on the interface with each render pass. So starting at the top of the list, you have your composite or beauty pass output. Next is your matte output. This is followed by 3D motion, which generates 3D motion vector data based on 3D object and camera movement in action. Great for post-motion blur effects. Next is the Albedo pass, which gives you a flat composite without any shading. Then you have the Ambient Occlusion, which simulates soft shadows from indirect lighting. This is followed by the background output if you used one in action. Next is the Emissive light pass, the Gmask output pass, and a separate lens flare pass. There is also a 2D motion vector pass, which is not to be confused with the 3D motion vector pass higher up in the list. Both have various uses for post-processing effects. Next, you have a normals lighting pass, an occluder pass, a position pass for 3D coordinates in RGB, and a reflection pass. The roughness pass creates a data pass for all objects in various shades of grey. This also helps when you need extra 3D data with certain post-processing effects. Finally, we have the shadow pass, the specularity lighting pass, and the UV coordinate pass for object texturing and the various Z-depth passes. Z-depth is the standard distance information embedded in a render pass. And Z-depth HQ is a flame-specific render pass which contains even more information compared to the regular Z-depth. In fact, the Z-depth HQ pass is a 32-bit pass made up of two 16-bit channels. No existing batch node actually supports this render pass, with the exception of the Matchbox GLSL shader. If the GLSL shader is correctly programmed, you could take advantage of this in Matchbox, Lightbox, and Camera Effects post-processing. If you want to examine the coding, you can look in the Matchbox example directory for sample files included with your Flame product install. So that was a brief summary of all the available render passes. Before we move on to the next video, you need to know that the render passes actually perform two functions for action. The first one, which you've already seen, is creating render pass outputs from action. The second function of render passes is the ability to create post-processing effects without having to leave the action environment. These post-processing effects are called camera effects, and we'll start checking them out in the next video. Be sure to check out the other videos covering the features, workflows, and updates to the Flame 2017 products. Comments, feedback, and suggestions are always welcome and appreciated. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to the Flame Learning channel for future videos.